FunnyPlaying is a company known for their IPS screen replacements to upgrade your Game Boy from all different models. They provide full kits to do the upgrade and even have laminated screens so that there won't be a gap between the screen lens and the screen itself. It makes your old, possibly broken Game Boy an absolute joy to play with such massive upgrades. Now, FunnyPlaying has taken all of the pieces that they sell individually and released a budget-friendly emulation device that at a first glance looks identical to a Game Boy Pocket. It runs Android, has an IPS screen, and has the potential to be a fantastic budget option for retro gaming, coming in at just $99. Is the FunnyPlaying RetroPixel the best new handheld to get? We'll do a deep dive into the hardware, software, gameplay, and overall experience to answer those questions. So get subscribed and let's get started. The FunnyPlaying RetroPixel Pocket has a rather unimpressive unboxing. It immediately has an impression of being very cheap. This outer box just feels a little corny to me. One thing that's interesting to note is that on this box it has a 2022 copyright, which might mean that this device maybe was intended to be released quite some time ago. But inside of this box is another box. This box feels a lot more on par with what I think a nicer unboxing experience would be. If it just placed the specs on the inside of this box, we don't need the outer box at all. Inside of this box though, we're finally at the device. And that's actually all that's inside, just the device. No micro SD card, no charging cable, and no instruction manual. The device itself surprisingly looks and feels nearly identical to a Game Boy Pocket, of course with the exception of the 2 additional face buttons. The specs for this device are rather low. It's got a 3-inch 720 by 720 laminated screen, a 3000 mAh battery, 1 GB of RAM, and 8 GB of internal storage. It also does have Wi-Fi built in. The device comes in at $99, although right now at the release of this video it is showing as sold out on their website. The 3-inch IPS screen actually does look pretty decent. With a 720 by 720 resolution, it's not quite as high pixel density as an analog Pocket, but it's certainly a step up from the Game Boy's screen, which was a whole 160 by 144 pixels. The ABXY rubber membrane buttons are smaller than the Game Boy's, but do feel pretty good. When testing button responsiveness, I did find that you have to press A, B, X, and Y down fairly firmly for the button press to be detected. The D-pad feels really similar to the Game Boy Pockets, but it is a bit sensitive. When hitting down on the D-pad, you can easily have it register as left or right, which could result in unintended inputs. The back of the device has no cartridge slot, but is still very similar to the analog Pocket, with some branding on the back and the L and R triggers. The bottom of the device has a headphone port and a USB-C port for charging. On the left of the device we have a brightness wheel, and on the right we have a volume wheel. They're more like rockers, but I definitely like that they kept the wheel aesthetic. Even the top of the device has a power switch nearly identical to the Game Boy Pocket. It doesn't quite function that way, it's more like a slider, but still a cool aesthetic. We're launched into a pre-set-up version of ATV Launcher. There's a section for apps which includes a front end for ROMs, RetroArch, and then a few standalone emulators like PSP and Dreamcast. Browsing through settings, we've got some bare-bone controls, none of which I really plan to mess with. Through the settings though, we can connect to Wi-Fi, which is straightforward enough. I kept wanting to touch the screen during the setup, but despite this being an Android device, there is no touchscreen support here. If we dive into system settings, we can actually see that this is running Android 7. Just for reference, Google is preparing for their Android 14 release this year, and Android 7 was released in 2016, with its final update in 2019. This isn't really a big deal for a budget device, but when you connect it to Wi-Fi, it's a bit concerning what kind of security holes you may be opening yourself up to. Anyway, we can get into loading this device up with games. One thing to note is that there are no games preloaded on this device, so you will have to load up your own. On the RetroPixel home screen, we have an FTP app, so I wanted to see how well it worked to not have to plug the device or the microSD card directly into the computer at all. Starting up the FTP app was actually easy enough. It gives you your device's IP address and a username and password even my grandma could guess. When I first connected to the FTP app, it seemed like I only had access to the internal storage and not the SD card. I started clicking around and I saw that there was a ROMs folder, and it looks like it was trying to symlink the microSD card into a folder there, but mine just had an empty folder called No TF Card Found. I figured I might as well try to reboot the device. but I actually got a weird message that said if I reboot the device, all third-party apps will be disabled. I didn't want to give that a try, so I decided to just power it down regularly. When I connected back to the FTP server and checked that same folder, it auto-populated with a bunch of folders for games. I'm definitely impressed that this just worked, although I wish it was a bit more intuitive. Loading up games is easy enough. Just drag your ROMs from your games collection into each corresponding folder onto the device. Okay, we're ready to test out some gameplay. Let's start out with what this device seems to have been made for: Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Launching an original Game Boy game, I was impressed that the colorization settings were already set and the aspect ratio for the game was correct out of the box as well. The games run at full speed too, which I would hope considering Game Boy is not a very power-intensive system to emulate. But unfortunately, it seems like that's where the fun ends. The button inputs I alluded to earlier are in fact a huge problem here. Not only do I have accidental presses when I'm playing Tetris and using the D-pad, but unless I press the A or B button down far enough, button presses are just simply not registered. Moving on to Game Boy Advance though, I was impressed to find here that also the aspect ratio was preset correctly. With Game Boy Advance, we do get some pretty sizable letterboxing, but it's the same on the Analog Pocket as well. Games do play at full speed, but again, the buttons not registering is really just a non-starter, of course. Heading into home consoles, NES performs fine and the scaling is correct. Super Nintendo unfortunately doesn't pass the Yoshi's Island test. So while a decent amount of Super Nintendo games should play fine, don't expect all of them to, or expect some occasional slowdown. I also found that the button mapping for Super Nintendo was pretty wrong, so you will have to remap the controls for this one. Just for fun, I booted up an N64 game, but the controller doesn't even have enough buttons, even if the games were playable. I mostly just ended up with the N64 emulator crashing. I was able to get F-Zero running, but not quite at full speed and it had a lot of audio stuttering. Taking a quick glance at Dreamcast, I'd unfortunately consider it unplayable. This isn't just because there's a frame skip of 1 by default, which when turned off results in a lot of audio stuttering, but I also couldn't adjust the emulator to a 4:3 aspect ratio in the game settings. And, to top it all off, I couldn't get the controller to remap because the Flycast emulator is too squished to easily navigate on the screen. Since the emulator was included, we had to give PSP a try. As expected, it's not really playable. The letterboxing is massive, but the real issue is that it requires a frame skip, so it has very choppy experiences for games like Grand Theft Auto. PlayStation 1 actually performed okay though, so simple games like Crash Bandicoot may be fine to play performance-wise. While gaming, one thing that was interesting to me was that it got surprisingly warm right behind the screen. Nothing too hot or anything too concerning, but considering we're really not doing anything too intense here, I was surprised it felt warm at all. So in its current state, the FunnyPlaying Pocket just has too many hardware issues to actually consider playing games with this device, which is really a bummer. I think the RetroPixel really has potential. But for me, since this thing is just e-waste at this point, I figured there's no harm in cracking this device open and seeing if we can fix it all. I've got two goals in this surgery: make the D-pad less sensitive and make the ABXY buttons more sensitive. The D-pad seemed like an easy fix, but I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do about the ABXY buttons. I tried to place the Kapton tape on the diagonals, slightly overlapping the conductive area. This somewhat worked. I could definitely go back and perfect it, since the D-pad directionals were still a little sensitive. For the ABXY buttons, I hoped I could just replace the rubber membrane with the D-pad from a Game Boy DMG or a Game Boy Pocket, but neither fit. The posts were brought in too much and the rubber membranes wouldn't have lined up with the buttons. This brought me down a rabbit hole. I spent about an hour and a half fumbling through soldering micro switches onto the ABXY pads. I actually eventually got the X and Y working really well. From the button tester, you can see the sensitivity is perfect. However, I did seem to permanently destroy the A and B, arguably the most important buttons on a device I plan to play Game Boy games on. It was a really cool experiment, and I'll have to try again when I level up my soldering skills. So in its current state, I think it's pretty clear that this device is unusable. With these pretty big hardware issues aside, I actually really like the device. FunnyPlaying got surprisingly close to a great emulation handheld, but in the end, their first attempt just doesn't work. The concept of the FunnyPlaying RetroPixel is actually great. It's pretty much set up and ready to go once you load up games right out of the box. I also like how they've included an FTP app, making it really easy to get games loaded up on the device without even plugging anything into a computer. I usually rag on devices that don't have a touchscreen, but I actually think it works pretty well here. Jumping into games with the correct RetroArch settings already adjusted for proper screen aspect ratio is absolutely awesome. I don't even mind the incredibly low version of Android considering how insanely low spec this device is. While the device is clearly super underpowered, I don't think that's the problem here. The FunnyPlaying RetroPixel had the potential to be a fantastic budget alternative to the analog Pocket for emulation, but unfortunately, the hardware engineering of this device is just downright awful. The concept and design is great, but the implementation just straight up doesn't work. The D-pad is too sensitive and the ABXY buttons just aren't sensitive enough, and you can't even easily reboot it. We took the device apart to attempt to fix it, but whether that works or not, is everybody expected to do that? At $99, this Game Boy Pocket-inspired device could have been an amazing pickup, but maybe it's best that FunnyPlaying sticks to providing the pieces for Game Boy mods instead of jumping into the retro emulation scene. On the other hand though, if FunnyPlaying made a 2.0 of this device and addressed all of these issues, I would be willing to give it another shot because the concept of this device is great. I've got a link in the description in case you are interested in picking one up, but as far as a recommendation from me, this device is a hard pass. What are your thoughts on the FunnyPlaying RetroPixel? Do you think it had potential to be a great budget handheld? Should they just stick to Game Boy mods and exit the emulation scene as silently as they entered it? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube or follow me on Twitch so you don't miss more unboxings, device testings, and device reviews. And thanks for watching.